Well, good morning, and do keep that passage open in front of you as we look through it together. But I wonder, imagine being so hated by your brothers that they conspire to kill you. And then they throw you into a cistern and they leave you there to die. But in fact, they don't do that because they can profit from you. And so they sell you into slavery and you become someone else's possession and you're treated less than human. And you're taken away into a foreign country miles away from home. And when you're there, well, you're imprisoned for a crime that you never committed. And then you're forgotten by all of those people that you met in prison that said that they would remember you. And you're having to sit there in prison for 20 years, waiting to be released. The prime of your life completely wasted. And yet, in God's sovereignty, after 20 years, you then become the second most powerful person in the world at that moment. And you have the opportunity to have the people that caused all of your suffering and all of your pain standing right in front of you. And you have the power and the authority to do whatever you want. But I wonder, what would you do? Because that is the situation that Joseph is confronted with in our passage this morning. And it's been quite a journey as we've been going through Genesis so far. We've been seeing the story and the journey of Joseph. And we've been seeing his sufferings and the trials and the injustices that he has had to face. And yet we saw last week that he is now the second most powerful person in the whole world at this moment. We saw last week that as he rides through the city, people have to bow down before him and people have to make way for him. Pharaoh even said in a passage last week that people won't be able to even lift their hand or foot without Joseph first saying that they can. This is the power and the authority that he has. And Joseph, he's been elevated to that position because of an interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams that God had given him. And through that, he's been able to save Egypt from a severe famine. And in fact, not just Egypt, but in fact, he's saving the whole world at this moment. It says in the verse right before our passage starts that the whole world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. And when we hear that, we think, well, wow. Because, it actually points us back to a promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham being Joseph's great-grandfather. And God promises Abraham that he would make him and his family, his descendants, into a great nation, that he would give them a land. And that also God, through Abraham's family, his descendants, would bless all the families of the world. And here we see Joseph, one of Abraham's descendants, having grain and providing grain for the whole world. And it's a sign, it's a hint of God's commitment to his promise to bless the whole world through this family. And yet, as we've been going through Genesis and we've been given an insight into this family that is going to apparently in some way bring blessing to the world, although Joseph has been proving faithful, well, the story of the rest of his brothers has been anything but. We've seen in the chapters as we've been going through, we see sons like Simeon and Levi, and they've gone to towns and completely wiped and destroyed them all, destroying the Shechemites, we see. Reuben, the eldest, we see in chapter 35 that he commits incest with his father's concubine. In chapter 38, we see Judah, another one of the sons, and he commits such immoral things with Tamar. And then to cap it off, all of the brothers then conspire and plot to kill Joseph. And they sell him into slavery. And what's more is that they then deceive their father and they tear up Joseph's robes and they dip it in blood and they tell their father that Joseph, he's been killed, unfortunately, by wild animals. And if these are the people, if this is the family whom God is going to bless the world, well, they aren't doing a great job of it. And yet, God could have always started again, couldn't he? Jesus even says that in Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. Jesus says, I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. God could have easily started again. And yet, he doesn't start again. God doesn't pick a new set of brothers that would be better. In fact, he continues. And even in our passages we'll see this morning, God works. God is working to bring them back in order that he might rescue them. And we see that all the way through our passage this morning. We see even at the start that Jacob, he's been affected by this famine that is affecting the whole world. And he hears that grain is for sale over in Egypt. And so he tells his sons to go down to Egypt to go and buy some of this grain. And yet who happens to have been placed in the position of distributing all the grain to the whole world? Well, it's the person that they tried to get rid of. God is working, we'll see this morning. God is working behind the scenes to rescue them and to bring them back. And yet, also, as we'll see this morning, in order for God to bring back these brothers, well, before grace can be received for them, their guilt must be recognised. Before grace can be received, guilt must be recognised. And that's what we're going to see this morning. And there are 2 points as we go through our passage. And the first one is guilt, from verses 1 to 24. You see, the brothers, they finally come to Egypt and they eventually encounter Joseph, but they don't recognise him. Of course, this would have been 20 years since they last saw their brother after they sold him into slavery. 20 years since they last saw him. Joseph would have looked like an Egyptian. He would have dressed like an Egyptian, like a ruler of those times. He wouldn't have looked like his brothers would have. And yet, as Joseph encounters his brothers, as we all the way through this encounter, the things that happen all the way through happen to point out and to expose and to highlight all the things that the brothers did to Joseph. You see, firstly, we see that they come before Joseph and they have to bow before him. They bow before him in verse 6. Now, you might remember the dream that started all of this off, the dream that caused such envy and jealousy amongst the brothers that they wanted to kill Joseph. A dream where Joseph said that one day all of the brothers will bow down before him. And this dream that provoked and stirred up so much anger that they sold Joseph off because of this dream that he had. And yet, a few chapters later, here we are. And this promise, this dream has come true. His brothers are bowing down before him, pointing them back to that moment before they sold him off into slavery. And then Joseph, well, as he has his brothers before him, he decides to play a little game called Undercover Brother. And he starts accusing them of being spies that have been sent to search out the land. And the brothers, clearly in fear of their lives, they plead their innocence by saying that, they're just ordinary people and they have a brother back home and they have a father back home. They're ordinary people from Canaan who have simply come to buy grain so that they might not die. And yet Joseph, he sets out a test. And that comes in verse 16, if you look with me. Joseph says, "Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth." If you are telling the truth. Which is interesting because these brothers have done anything but tell the truth. You think about the story when they sold Joseph into slavery. They then went back to their father and they deceived their father Jacob. And they said that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal and they ripped up the robe and dipped it in blood. And Joseph, he tests one thing in particular, their honesty and their integrity, pointing them back to the way that they had totally deceived their father and covered up their evil schemes. And finally, we see that after the brothers had pleaded with Joseph, Joseph then sends all of them back, apart from one, Simeon. And Simeon, as it says, was bound, verse 24, before their eyes. Now, I don't know exactly what the brothers would have been thinking, what would have been going through their head as they saw Simeon being bound before their eyes. But surely, as their brother was being bound and taken away from them, surely their minds must have gone back 20 years to when they bound and sent away their brother Joseph. Surely, as they saw that, it must have reminded them of what they did to their brother. And so all of these things in this first section, they highlight and they remind the brothers of Joseph and what they did to him. And we know it did because at the end of this section, we see that it's clear that they equate all that is happening to them at this moment to what they did to Joseph 20 years ago. They say in verse 21, look with me, they say, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." For the brothers, it's finally happened. The light bulb has been switched on and the brothers realise their sin. They recognise their guilt. And it brings them to a point where they're truly humbled in our passage. They're truly humbled by what they have done, humbled to the point where they know, they realise, and they expect to be held to account for what they've done. For them, they know that the game is over. The running has stopped and the pretending has been exposed. And this morning, the truth is that one day we will have to bow down before someone far greater than Joseph. Not just the ruler of a nation, but the ruler and the sustainer of the universe. A king with more glory and authority than we could ever imagine. As Philippians 2 verse 10 says, that every knee will bow and every tongue will have to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And whilst we might not have sold him into slavery or thrown him into a cistern, each of us in our own way have rejected him. We've maybe lived by trying to pretend and put off who he is, pretending that he's still dead, lying in a grave in Jerusalem, forgotten about. We don't need to worry about him anymore. But just like Joseph, Jesus has been elevated and he's been lifted. And Jesus, he's been raised and he's been given power and authority far more than Joseph. And one day it says we will bow before him. And when we stand before him, we will be truly humbled. When we stand before him, we will recognise our guilt, the way that we have treated him. Someone once said, before we can hear the words, "You are forgiven," we must be able to say the words, "I have sinned." Before grace can be received, guilt must be recognised. Guilt is our first point in our passage. But secondly, this morning, we see grace. We see grace. And that's from verses 25 to 38. You see, whilst the brothers have recognised their guilt, and whilst they have their brother, who they sold into slavery, right in front of them, what happens next? Whilst might not be a surprise to us this morning, well, it's everything that we shouldn't expect to happen. Look with me at verse 25. It says, "Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. In fact, what Joseph does is far from treating them like he was treated, but in fact, he models the most amazing picture of grace for us this morning. You see, Joseph, instead of ordering their punishment, he orders his servants to fill their bags with grain. And let's remember, grain's not just, some nice food for them to eat. Grain in this situation that they're in is the difference between life and death. If we look back in verse 2 of our passage, Jacob says to his sons, he says, "Go down there and buy some for us so that we might live and not die." And so when Joseph, he's filling their bags with grain, this is Joseph saving his family, providing a way of rescue from starvation. And yet what's more incredible is that these brothers, along with the grain that they go home with, also find silver in their bags as well. Meaning that these brothers don't even have to pay for the grain that they've received. Joseph freely gives it to them. It's interesting, isn't it, when you think back to that moment when these brothers last saw their brother Joseph, and they profited from Joseph's life. They sold him into slavery, and yet now they are profiting from their brother's grace to them, from the gift of grain and even their silver and provisions for the journey. It's an abundance thing. They've been given more than they could ask for. They deserve none of it. They pay for none of it. And yet they receive all of it as they go back home. And this was what God was wanting. This is what God was working towards. God even took their evil deeds, their sin, took the broken situation that Joseph was placed in. And as Joseph says, and Joseph will say later on in the book of Genesis, he says, God worked it for good. And not just the good of Joseph, but for the good of his brothers who sold and rejected their brother. This is God's grace to his people. This is what God has been working in order to provide a rescue for his people. And this morning, can you believe that the one that we have rejected, the one that we have in many ways exchanged things that we thought were way more precious for, the one that we thought was maybe dead and buried, the one we thought was confined to the pages of history, well, now he stands in glory and authority. And we bow before him, completely powerless, completely guilty before him. And yet Jesus, just like Joseph in our passage this morning, stands ready to offer us not just mercy, but grace. Someone helpfully said and explained it this way, that mercy is not getting what I deserve. And yet grace is getting what I don't deserve. One of Phil's favourite illustrations that he'll use on Christianity Explored, and I think he's even used at church from time to time, is the illustration of grace found in Les Miserables. And he's used it so many times that I thought it'd probably be best if I went and watched the film. I'd never watched it before, the musical or anything like that, but I decided to go and watch the film. And I just warn you, it is a very long film, and so if you're planning on watching it, I would book out the whole evening. And I only got through half of it, I will confess that, but it's okay because the illustration came in the half I did watch. And in Les Miserables, there's the main character, Jean Valjean, and he's in a desperate situation. And he takes refuge and shelter outside the home of this priest. And the priest, he sees and finds Jean Valjean and welcomes him in and feeds him, offers him food and drink and a bed for the night. And yet, in the middle of the night, Jean Valjean, he wakes up And he goes and robs the priest of all of his treasures, all of his silver, and puts it in his bag and runs away. And yet Jean Valjean, he's caught by the authorities. And he even dares to say and come up with the excuse that the priest had given him these pieces of silver that were in his bag, that they were a gift to him. And so the authorities, they drag him to the home of the priest. And the authorities say, he says that you are given them as a gift. And to everyone's surprise, including Jean Valjean, the priest confirms that what Jean Valjean had been saying is true. And so the priest offers Jean Valjean mercy, and he asks that the authorities release him and let him go. He offers him mercy. And yet what's more incredible in this film is that the priest, after asking Jean Valjean and letting them off the hook, he then turns round and he goes to find the two most precious pieces of silver in his house. And he gets the 2 silver candlesticks on his table. And he says to Jean Valjean, but you have forgotten to take these as well. And he gives them the 2 candlesticks. An amazing act of grace. He gives to Jean Valjean everything that he doesn't deserve. Not just mercy, but grace. And this morning, like the brothers, like Jean Valjean, we come before Jesus, not only receiving mercy, but receiving grace. Receiving more than we came to him with. Jesus, he doesn't just forgive us and not treat us as we deserve, but rather he gives us grace. As Ephesians says, he blesses us with every spiritual blessing. He gives us an eternal inheritance, an eternal hope to look forward to. He adopts us into his family, that we become children of God. He gives us his Spirit to live within us, and so much more. His word to follow. Jesus offers grace this morning. We deserve none of it. We pay for none of it. We earn none of it. We cannot earn it. But we receive all of it from him this morning. And yet, in our passage this morning, we would think that maybe the brothers would be overjoyed at seeing what's in their bags, at receiving provisions of grain, and they haven't even had to pay for it. What a result. And yet in our passage this morning, it's interesting to see how they respond. Look with me at verse 28. It says, my silver has been returned. He said to his brothers, here it is in my sack. Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, what is this that God has done to us? And then they go back to their family, they go back to their father Jacob. And Jacob says, when he hears all of this news, he says, verse 36, he says, everything is against me. And so here are Jacob, here are Joseph's brothers, and they are crying out that everything seems to be against them. They're saying that God is working against them at this moment. And we, the reader, as we've been going through this story, we hear that. And we know that in actual fact, God has not been working against them. God has been working for them. And when they cry out, what is this that God has done? They don't see what God has done in providing a rescue for them, bringing this grace in the grain and the silver and the provisions for their family, in Joseph being brought about to that position in order that they might receive that rescue. They can't see what God has done. This has been the whole story of Genesis. That we've been seeing that as Jacob and the brothers, they think it looks one way. Actually, they can't see the way in which God has been working. Even in a trial, even in a tragedy, even in their own sin, God has been working in order to bring them back. And not just bring them back, but in order that they might be rescued and saved from this famine. And it might even be this morning that we hear what Jacob and the brothers have been saying, And we maybe echo that at times. We maybe think that in some way God is working against us. We might be thinking, we might refuse to even think or entertain a thought that God would ever be gracious or merciful towards us. That's not what he's wanting to do. And yet this morning, that is exactly what God has done. And just like Jacob and the brothers didn't do, we need to step back and we need to take one big look and see what God has done, the way in which God has been working in order to bring us back to him this morning, to rescue each of us this morning, and to show us the most incredible grace that we could ever imagine this morning. Do you know, we saw at the start, I mentioned about that promise that God gave to Abraham at the start of Genesis, that through his family, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And do you know what? 42 generations later, after Abraham, through so many broken situations, through so many broken people along the way, 42 generations later, there is one descendant of Abraham that comes, Jesus. And through him, through his trials, through his sufferings, through even his death on the cross, being like Joseph, unjustly condemned, well, on that cross, Jesus makes a way for all of our guilt to be completely removed forever, for us to be forgiven. And Jesus, 3 days later, he rises again. And so that he offers the whole world this grace, this opportunity, not just to be forgiven, but to have everything that comes with God's grace, with an eternal inheritance, with life to come instead of death. And he offers this to all nations. And so this morning, as we look at what God has done throughout history, what God has done through his Son, the Lord Jesus, I hope we see just how much, the lengths, the depth that God has gone to in order that we might be brought back, in order that we might be rescued, working through broken situations, desperate situations, broken people, in order to fulfill his promises, in order that grace might be offered to each of us this morning. You know, there's a man called H.C. Turnbull, and he once said that Calvary, that's the cross. He says Calvary shows just how much man will go in their sin, but how far God will go for their salvation. And you know, this morning, we've seen these brothers confronted with their guilt. They have no ground to stand on, and they stand before the very person that they have tried to kill. And yet this morning, we've seen that Joseph demonstrates the most extraordinary grace to them, even the brothers that had tried and plotted to kill him and sold him into slavery. And this morning, do you know, I hope we see more than anything, just like Joseph and everything that God did to bring about his purposes, bring about this rescue. I hope we see this morning how far God has gone to bring each of us this morning this rescue that he offers in Jesus. How far God has gone to extend to us this morning the grace that he has in store, that he wants us to receive and to know this morning. Guilt, yes, but God extends to us grace, such amazing grace to us through Jesus this morning.